Did you know that you can donate appreciated stock and not pay capital gains tax? Contact legacy@acton.org for more info.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. And today I'm joined by two colleagues. I have Dr. John Pinheiro, director of research here at the Acton Institute, and I have Dr. Dylan Pahman, research fellow at the Acton Institute and founder and president of the St. Nicholas Cabasilas Institute. John and Dylan have edited a new and very needful book published by the Acton Institute, The Christian Roots of American Liberty, a reader. John, welcome to Acton Line. Thank you for being with us. Dylan, also, welcome to Acton Line. Thank you for being with us.
Great to be here.
Happy to be here, of course.
So, this is a book that's the fruit of, I think, like a lot of conversations we've had around the office, particularly around a lot of controversies. And these controversies aren't isolated to the political left or the political right. There is a general sort of, I guess, civilizational ennui in which folks are rethinking basically fundamental things like liberalism, like the American founding, like pluralism, religious liberty. And there's a whole lot of people doing that for a whole lot of different reasons. How did those factor in your minds as you were conceiving of this project? Because I think this is very much a sort of answer to several controversies on different fronts.
Yeah, so this the book began as a paper I wrote for a conference I presented at. It was organized by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. And the idea, we actually organized a whole panel. And so we were going to have ancient, medieval, and modern kind of Christian antecedents to American liberty. And then because of some scheduling issues, I ended up having to do ancient and modern. So it ended up being a kind of big paper and substantial one. And so after the conference, we thought, well, what can we do with this? And we decided to kind of split it up. The introductions began as different sections of that paper. And then we added these readings. And the goal was to address, at least for that paper, in particular, more of the voices on the right. So there's people today, national conservatives, post-liberals, Christian nationalists, all of whom have actually very different goals and perspectives, but they share certain assumptions in common. And they in certain values in terms of they don't like religious liberty. They think that was a mistake, right? If they like the American founding, they try to say, well, it actually fits into my box that is less free than what people ordinarily think of it as. Or they say the American founding is hopelessly secular and liberal and Enlightenment sort of project and we need to throw it out. And I think any decent historian who is familiar with the history of ideas knows that neither of those claims are correct. If you just have any familiarity with the history of thought, you know that there, of course, is a unique genius to the American founding, but there's also a rich heritage that informs it. And so we wanted to give people just a single book where they can kind of read that case for that perspective, but then also read the actual sources themselves, make up their own mind, right? See, how Irenaeus talks about natural law, or how, the Edict of Milan declared religious liberty in 313 AD in ancient Rome. And you can go on and on and on throughout Christian history and see all these sorts of principles already present.
John, could you take a stab at sort of how this answers some sort of left-wing criticisms of the American founding? Because Dylan's right, and the origins of this struck out as responding to particular sort of right-wing critics. But those aren't the only critics of this vision out there, and there's criticism from another direction. And how did you conceive of particularly the things on the American founding in this that you contribute a lot to responding to those critics?
Well, there has been for a lot longer left-wing critics of the founding than right-wing critics of the founding. So the right-wing criticism of the founding is the newer thing. So yeah, that's a great question. What about the left wing? So in general, I would say there's a couple categories. One is the 1619 project style that looks at the founding as one part of a history, not of liberty, not of the development of liberty, but slavery and oppression is really the American story, and liberty is kind of an outlier. So we're not looking at some long growth of liberty and talking about liberty, but really just slavery. So 1619 is the important founding year for the 1619 project.
This is the introduction of slavery in North America.
Yes, right. And so, but not 1776 or not 1787. Etc. But then there's also that secular reading of the founding, which looks for such a separation of church and state that is unwilling to acknowledge Jewish influence, Christian influence, overall Christian cultural influence. They want to label everyone a deist, not knowing sometimes, I think, what deism is or was or could be or the varieties of it. And so that secular reading is something this book also pushes against. So on the one side, then we have Christian nationalists and neo-Catholic integralists. And I understand Christian nationalism is a fraught term, but at least those that I would argue promote a kind of Protestant triumphalism that reads many other peoples out of the founding in a way that the founders themselves wouldn't have thought. But then the neo-integralist Catholics who flirt with the post-liberalism. They also, each in their own way, promote an illiberal reading of the founding because they think religious liberty and too much liberty has been a problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Dylan started to answer this question, but I want to put it to you, John, to get your perspective. Why is a reader in particularly a good answer to these critics? Because I was excited about it when I heard you were doing it this way. I'll start. My thoughts about this were so many of these folks, be they the integralists, be they the Christian nationalists, they appeal to historical sources. But I think the way they do it is selective. I think it's highly selective. I think many times they don't take into account the work of actual historians that do work on these periods to sort of contextualize these readings in a constructive way. And I think they sort of weaponize the historical narrative and that they quote mine and the rest of it. And I was really pleased that, for many of these you have short sections, but for many of these you have long selections. And I think, what happens, most people don't read history. Most people, even people who are really into history, they watch the History Channel, or they'll pick up, maybe like Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton.
You're gonna
something.
make me cry. Is there a box of tissue?
No, but I mean, even folks who like history, they're not looking at primary sources. And so when somebody comes up and they sound very confident and they quote certain sources and they can come off to many people as very well versed in the history. And they could think, oh my goodness, like I never knew all this. Well, you still don't know it. You've now been told a story that's used history as a prop to make an argument, but you actually don't know the history. And I think this book goes a long way to addressing that. What's your perspective on that, John?
One of the things we see now is people talking past each other much more than they did in the past. So people have always talked past each other and used the same term differently, and then they're arguing about different things and they don't know it. But particularly with social media, where a lot of it, especially the integralism lives and some of this Christian nationalism, the worst parts of it live, they talk to an echo chamber, and you only read what convinces you already, and it's just kind of confirming what you think you already know. But one of the things you're often not doing is really delving into the primary sources. So there's a couple different ways to go after those arguments. One is to prove that they're wrong, right? And to write essays about the wrong and picking them apart, or taking on integralism, for example, the way the book by James Patterson and Thomas Howells that we're publishing later this year is going to do by looking at historical instances of its failures. But the other way is to promote the good and to promote the right kind of argument. And by the right kind of argument, I mean one supported by actual documents and sources that is selective only in the sense that, we're not going to have a 3,000-page book here. But on the other hand, it's selective to show that these particular parts of the argument that says the founding is secular and not Christian and liberal in the ways that will define a straw man liberalism, that's incorrect. And so what a reader can do is, especially this size, it's so manageable and there's questions at the end of every chapter to help you work through it. These kinds of readers are popular in, well, I won't say popular with the students, but popularly used in history courses at the college level for a reason, because history professors realized several decades ago that their students weren't reading primary sources anymore, and you don't just want to give them the secondary source. I mean, some professors do, right? So they can give you their version of history and you have no way of testing it, but they want to teach you how to do history, how to interpret history. So books like this can help you do that. So they're very popular in courses, but the problem I found as a professor over many years was that not only are the sources in those books selective, they're geared to push you towards an argument that's there from the very beginning. And so you'll often find excerpts rather than whole sources. Now, we have excerpts in here, but that's because some of these sources are so long. But what we haven't done is what a popular series did to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which the source I had used for a couple of years, I realized it was editing out everything about Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and human dignity. I thought, well, no wonder they're coming away looking at this at the civil rights movement as some kind of secular project, and not one that was inspired in the Christian churches, some of the Christian churches in the South. So I want folks to take this book, you read it, and you say, so the founding is secular, then why are they talking about God so much? Or this is a creature of the Enlightenment period, then why is somebody going all the way back to, Dylan mentioned Irenaeus? Why is he talking about similar things? What do we see in the elective processes of religious orders during the medieval period? So we have enough snippets here where someone should come away from this book and go, oh, the story's bigger and much more complex. Maybe it's not an either or, maybe it's a both and, but at least you have more information from this book. And I think that's the key to any reader, and especially our reader, The Christian Roots of American Liberty. What you're going to see is we start with the Church Fathers and go all the way up through George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. So Acton has had this project for a long time to take a look at the School of Salamanca and the late scholastics and tracing liberty before liberalism as it was understood. What Dylan and I have done with this is just take it even further back all the way to the early centuries of the church.
Yeah. The book opens with a great quote from Lord Acton, one of my favorites. The greater part of the political ideas of Milton, Locke, and Rousseau may be found in the ponderous Latin of Jesuits who were subjects of the Spanish crown, of Lessius, Molina, Mariana, and Suarez. So we get into those scholastics, but this goes back even further. And one of the interesting things, this is structured into parts, and then it's structured within those parts historically. And each of those parts begins with the fathers. Mm-hmm. And Dylan, this is where you put in a lot of work.
Not the founding fathers, to be clear.
Yeah. This book begins and ends with fathers.
Yeah, that's right.
This is a very patriarchal history in a literal sense or in a figurative sense. Dylan, why? I mean, you've done this. You've done a lecture at Acton University, trying to draw this out for many years. Your other book on Orthodox social thought that came out earlier this year talks about this a lot. Why begin with the fathers when we're trying to think through the roots of American liberty?
Yeah. So there's a few reasons. So one thing just to add to the previous answer a little bit is that we're not trying to make the case, and you might think this by the title, we're not trying to make the case that like all the founding fathers were like devout Christians, because they weren't. It was maybe like 50-50 deist Christians, something like that. But they lived in a thought world that contain these ideas, and these ideas can be traced back to Christian sources. So, and in some cases, someone, a deist like Thomas Jefferson, we know, I can't remember who had this great appendix in their book on Tertullian and Thomas Jefferson, but he actually looked at Jefferson's library. Jefferson owned some of the works of Tertullian and actually underlined the passages about religious liberty. So you can see in our book, we have Tertullian talking about religious liberty. And then when you get to the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, it's not just they're both for religious liberty. They both make the same argument because Jefferson got it from Tertullian. So that's part of the reason why we go back there. It's because the Founding Fathers were classically educated, like anybody of their time. They could read Greek and Latin, and they did. They were familiar with people like Thomas Aquinas, with people like Tertullian, any of these sources that we look at. And that helps us kind of set a broader story. Because once again, the argument is also not trying to say that every Christian society that has ever existed has been a wonderful and free and flourishing place. That's not true. I wish that were true. There's been a mixed bag. Sometimes it's been kind of autocratic and bad, and sometimes it's been much more, free and flourishing. But our point is that the story is mixed, and a lot of the people who really want to represent a traditional form of their Christian faith today in our country today are actually buying the kind of what used to be a polemic against Christianity, that all of Christian history is this kind of, top-heavy, intolerant sort of system. They're saying, yes, it is, except that we want that now. And the reality is it's not. It's complicated. There were medieval republics. We have the Magna Carta in full in this volume to show that it's one among many examples in the Middle Ages of people saying we want more of a say in our government and we want more protections more for the basic rights that we hold. And that's a document that, it's often thought of as the aristocrats seizing power from the monarch, and it is, but it's just as much the church. The first article is that the English church remained free. So I think going all the way back to the fathers, you get a sense of, okay, there's a basic sort of philosophy and theology that all these things grow out of. So we start with natural law. We look at that and how rule of law, the idea that everyone should be equal before the law because everyone is created free and equal by God. That goes all the way back as far as we can go. I mean, we could have probably quoted Romans 2, but we decided not to include any biblical excerpts in the book. But to the 2nd century, some of the earliest apologists for the Christian faith are saying these things. When they argue against persecution, they argue for religious liberty, right? They just want to be treated equally like everyone else. They want to be tolerated like everyone else. And when the first emperor who became a Christian had a chance to do something about it, he actually didn't make the church the state religion. That didn't come till the end of the 4th century. Instead, he declared universal religious liberty. And so we want to show how these ideas, which we think of as modern and revolutionary and liberal, they may be all of those things, but they're also Christian. They also have a long pedigree that we need to be familiar with.
When Dylan says it's complicated, that's the value of the study of history, is learning to manage the complexity of human events, because it's just not so simple that it's secular versus Christian or some kind of liberalism versus Christian or Catholic versus everything else or Protestant versus secularism. It's much more complicated than that. There's a lot of ways, like Dylan mentions, that you could call the United States at its founding a Christian country. But what do you really mean by that?
Right?
Not what some think it means.
So this is very important because a lot of times people will take their ideological convictions and then try to superimpose them anachronistically on history. And the volume does not try to do that. It doesn't take, let's say, the values of, Michael Novak's elucidates in Spirit of Democratic Capitalism and say, see, everyone always believed all of these things. Yeah. And, it was just until the mid 80s when Michael Novak wrote the book that it all came together. But it traces different threads. that are components of what becomes that spirit of democratic capitalism, what becomes the best of sort of modern sort of liberal conservatism when we're talking about, these categories of, natural rights, rule of law, religious liberty, liberty and private property, limited government, representation and consent. These things all did exist these things all came from somewhere. They weren't always the same. They didn't always and they weren't always ideally implemented.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fits and starts with all of things. But the way to look at this book is not that it is presenting you with a sort of answer to every political question we have today, but rather that what you have here is you have a continuity of thinking about issues that we still grapple with today. Many of which have been adopted into modern, pluralistic, democratic, market-oriented societies that have often forgotten where those things came from in their own history. And this is a reintroduction for those people, but it's also a reintroduction for the folks hostile to it, that the values of modern civilization aren't all antithetical. Although many of them are antithetical to the church's teaching, not all of them are. And a lot of what shapes our modern world, a lot of the very best of what shapes our modern world comes from the church's own history and the church's own understanding. And I think that's really remarkable. How did you decide, because there are 5 of these sort of categories, how did you decide that those were the threads that you wanted to sort of pull out?
Yeah, so I was basing it in part on what I was reading in some of these other sources. So I had read Yoram Hazony, Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, and they were, like I said, some of them have different agendas, but they were in some ways saying a lot of the same things. So they don't like, democratic consent. They don't like religious liberty. They're skeptical of the need for limited government and separation of powers. And so I kind of thought through, well, as I'm reading their books, I keep thinking of things like, yeah, but, Justin Martyr says the opposite, or yeah, but, and so it kind of formed as I was reading through those books of, okay, these are the points that they're consistently getting wrong across the board. So we start with natural law, and they relate to one another. So I already mentioned kind of that connection between natural law, rule of law, and then religious liberty. The next part is private property. That Edict of Milan was actually not the first Edict of Toleration issued by Constantine in ancient Rome. 2 years earlier, Constantine Licinius, I should say, at that time there were 2 emperors. 2 years earlier, there was an Edict of Tolerance. But the reason why the church remembers the Edict of Milan and not the other one, is that the Edict of Milan restored the confiscated property of the church. And the church may be the first kind of non-family estate corporate entity to even have property rights in history. It's at least one of them. And it's because their property was returned, prisoners were freed, right? Freedom was given not just in a sense of you can be a Christian now and not be persecuted, but what was taken from them had been restored. That's why it was remembered. And so there's a link between these things. And then suddenly you have the church. This also kind of comes out of, what Constantine established. And again, very mixed bag in Christian Rome and Byzantium in terms of religious tolerance and things like that. And we talk about, almost immediately the next generation of emperors is persecuting Orthodox bishops. We have some readings from Athanasius in there. But even so, you suddenly see an empire that went from the emperor as Pontificus Maximus, who usually after their death would be deified by the Senate, to someone who, when Constantine marched into Rome, he refused to offer sacrifices to the pagan gods. When he became emperor, he basically downgraded the cult of the emperor to like a lavish fan club, right? So he's like, well, you guys can like me, but please don't offer any sacrifices, right? I'm not a god, right? This is amazing to think about in the ancient world. And on top of that, he acknowledged another polity within his polity, the church, that had its own jurisdiction, its own sovereignty. Very fraught relationship throughout history, but you see a check on the power of the emperor grow out of that. And it's, not a society many of us would want to go back to, but it was, as John said, it was part of a progression of liberty, right? It was much better than what came before, and it's part of the story of how did we get to where we're at. So those components, they all are connected by a certain logic, and I think that's, again, part of the genius of the American founding is really to have a strong sense of that logical connection between these principles, and to find a very creative way of trying to ensure them through the Declaration, through the Constitution. I'm a little sad that we didn't include the Northwest Ordinance in the volume, but I highly recommend people look that up as well. Certainly an important document of the founding. But those sorts of documents, the Federalist, the Bill of Rights, we have readings from all those, and you can see how these things are of a piece. They relate to one another. When James Madison in Federalist 51 talks about needing, checks on faction, he says, this is kind of how it works in religion too. Isn't it great that we have religious liberty and we have, nobody has this monopoly on religious power, and so they all have to actually try to attract people through persuasion to their cause. Well, we need more of that in the political realm, right? So he even sees a connection there.
So as a Michigander, we all know that the Northwest Ordinance is what culminates the culmination of the American experiment.
Of course,
is
yes.
its full realization.
The proper boundaries of the Midwest as
out
well.
here.
Yes.
Yep. This is where all of history has been leading, and we're right here in the middle of it here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. But speaking of where all of history is leading, because this is very interesting, because this starts with a very broad net of Christendom writ large is what you draw these sources from. And then we, in a sense, focus in on the American founding for the end of all of these. Why do it that way? Like, we've talked about it a little bit in terms of addressing controversies in America, political controversies in America. This is kind of an answer to them on both the left and the right critics of the founding. But I also think that when you talk about the unique American genius, and I'm going to turn to John to this question, I think there's really something true about, and Lord Acton thought this as well, who's English, and there are all sorts of great English historians who have noticed this, that America in many ways is the unique culmination of a lot of these principles we talked about, that have, again, been in the water in Western civilization since its very beginnings, have been in the water of even, non-Western civilizations. Ashoka, the first Buddhist king of India, is committed to religious liberty.
Acton points that out.
Yep,
Yeah.
and Acton points this out and recognizes this. But there is something very special about the Western tradition and the way these threads consistently reemerge, consistently develop, and then in the way that in America you have a really unique realization of these principles. And as an American historian, John, and this gets into sort of the metaphysics of why is American history in particular very special.
Yeah.
But I think there's something to it. I think there's a rhetorical reason why you return to the American Republic with all of these to address these controversies in the United States. But I think even readers, in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, in other parts of the world, like, there's something that's relevant for them too, not just because it's America, but because America stands for these things in a very unique way.
Yeah, when these ideas come out of America, let's start with the foreign part first, because it's the last thing you said. When these ideas come out of America, they ought to be received, I think, by people around the world as ancient ideas that America has adopted and sought to perfect and argued over. But they're not specifically American ideas where if you were to adopt them, somehow you're taking on you're being somehow ideologically colonized by the United States. So this is a common refrain, and it's a problem in parts of Africa, for instance, where the accusation will be, well, that kind of sense of private property or some of these sorts of laws, those are European or those are British or those are American, but they're not. What this volume does is take a snapshot of the American founding, because we're writing mostly for an American audience, to say the American founding is not only not what you think it is, but it's still what you have to make reference to, particularly if you're on the right and you're a conservative, because these are the foundational principles that ought to be conserved. But there's also universal principles in the founding, and they don't just come from the Christians, or they're transmitted by them, and that's the culture at the time of the founding. But we look in the Hebrew scriptures for private property, et cetera. We could even look among the ancient Greeks who were pagan for the practice of representation and elective government. We could look at the Roman Republic, as many of these founders did, much more so than they looked at Athenian democracy, for instance. So there's a whole sweep of Western civilization, and it just is true that the United States plays a key part in that moment. And this is why there was such a debate among the founders, where Jefferson thought this was going to be a new period of liberty. And he, like other Americans, supported, at least initially, the French Revolution for that reason. They thought this was going to take over the world. And others said, no, this is really just for the Americans, because we've inherited these British constitutional and legal and moral traditions.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we haven't talked about yet is we've talked about the fathers on both ends.
Both kinds.
The church fathers and the founding fathers. But we haven't talked about these scholastics and early modern figures that are the bridge, and that serve as the bridge in all of these documents. And this is really one of those things where, like, the Acton Institute's institutional legacy looms largest, because many of these selections from Juan de Mariana, from Niels Hemmingsen, come out of our sources in early modern ethics, economics, and law, which was a major sort of long-term commitment that Acton had to bringing a lot of these early modern thinkers who wrote on topics of ethics, economics, law, trying to apply Christian standards of morality and theological insights to the sort of emerging modern world that they're in, that is increasingly becoming commercial societies, trying to think about that in new, fresh ways. How did you approach making those selections as the bridge? And I think these folks are these are the folks that are underrated. When you talk to most people who would be intrigued by the title of this book, would be very interested off the bat in what America's founding fathers had to say and what figures in the early church had to say. They might not necessarily be coming for the Mariana, but they should.
Yeah. So one of the reasons to focus on these sources, just partly to show the continuity, that it's not just like a one period thing and then it died out and it was resurrected later on. There were always kind of living strands of liberty throughout Christian history. And it depended on the topic and the time and the context and all of those things. But another reason that I especially focused on some of these sources is because a lot of these critics, these modern day critics who have come out and they say all these things and people just presume they know what they're talking about. A lot of them really like to focus on John Locke. They say John Locke, everybody knows he's this liberal Enlightenment figure who's trying to come up with a state of nature myth to replace the Old Testament and replace a Christian understanding of society with a liberal, tolerant one or whatever. That's the kind of narrative that they spin. And once again, it's one of these things where I'm like, well, first of all, I've read John Locke, and he's constantly quoting the Bible. He's quoting some of these modern scholastics, especially Richard Hooker, but there's some other ones he references. And then you look at the person he's answering. His books, his True Treatises on Government, are an answer to Robert Filmer's Patriarcha. Robert Filmer begins that book, literally like page 1, talking about this crazy idea that's been going around, that everyone is free and equal and the only legitimate laws are those that people consent to. He says, that the Papists, the Roman Catholics, have bought into this. The Reformed have bought into this as well. And it goes all the way back to the schoolmen, as in the Middle Ages, the scholastics. So he's granting a pretty significant history. Oh, and he says the common people of his day all support this as well. But then he claims, but you can't find it in the Bible, the Church Fathers, or, according to the principles of natural law. So you look at what Locke is doing. He focuses a ton on the Bible and natural law because he's trying to answer Filmer's claims. And I wanted to show that there is some real continuity there. John Locke was an Enlightenment thinker. He did have some weird ideas when it comes to epistemology. He had some, I would say, unorthodox theology, although he wasn't a deist. He believed in miracles and revelation. But his political thought is actually, for the most part, pretty great continuity with a lot of what came before him. So, Mariana, we have a great quote on the back of the book that he's basically in 1609 says no taxation without representation. We have Matthew Hale talking about the origins of property in a person mixing their labor with what is among the commons. This is exactly John Locke's understanding of the origin of property. Matthew Hale said it as well and said it before him. And another concern, although we don't really explicitly get into their work, I think partly because it's not as well respected as some of these other sources, but Stephen Wolfe, his book on Christian nationalism, he leans heavily on the magisterial Reformation to try to make his case. Well, we have Melanchthon in our book. We have Matthew Hale. We have Niels Hemmingsen. We have some of these sources that tell a different story, and so that story needs to be told as well. And I always think one of the reasons to know history, and especially as a Christian, to know Christian history, is that when you are part of the church, you're part of the body of Christ, right? You look at the New Testament. St. Paul is always saying, brethren, right? Brothers and sisters, right? This is our family. This is our family history. So just as you want to know your own family's history, you want to, you find out something cool about your great-grandfather, you take an ancestry test or whatever, shouldn't we want to know our spiritual ancestry? Shouldn't we want to know about these things? And if it so happens the things that they cared for, that they fought for, that those principles found a certain unique culmination or fruition in the American founding, well, that's something that can actually help us bring together, how do I be a faithful Christian, a faithful member of this spiritual family, and also a faithful citizen of the country that I belong to today. So that's why I think those early modern sources are so important. They show the continuity, and they help, again, kind of dispel some of this weird sort of myth-making that a lot of these critics have come up with about John Locke in particular.
May I?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would add to that also in here, besides it, we back it up a little bit. We have the general chapter of the Dominicans and how the elective system of the Dominicans worked. We have canons and the results of Catholic Church councils during the Middle Ages that talk about the elective system and how you elect. We have the colonial charters and constitutions of the 13 American colonies. We also have the Maryland Toleration Act. And when you look at the whole sweep of this, when you talk about looking at our spiritual history, it's a lot like when you look at the history of Western culture, it's much like looking at the history of yourself or any individual person. There's good things, there's bad things. There's a sanctification that's occurring, and it's not always linear and upward, right? And so, but this is how, if we look introspectively, knowing ourselves, that was Greek wisdom, right? We look introspectively, we know this happens with cultures too. So the liberty we talk about, particularly religious liberty, you can see it as it's a work in progress, but it goes up and down. And we're kind of in a down period right now in American history. We've had other up periods. The Maryland Toleration Act is in here because it predated the Toleration Act in England, and but if you read it, you can be put to death for some things. That's probably not what most would consider toleration now. But there's a whole list of other things that earlier on you could have been exiled, put to death for, et cetera, and those things are all outlawed in the name of toleration. And you move forward, and there's Pennsylvania, and then we finally get to the First Amendment and other practices, and you can see that development definitely. But the ideas, as the title of the book says, there's Christian roots to this sense of liberty, and you see it keep coming back to the dignity of the human person, and that this is where religious liberty comes from, and the separation between what the state can do and ask for and coerce, and what it has no right to coerce from you.
There's also an interesting thread on civil society throughout this book, and this is where the Christian roots works in two different ways. There's one in the sense that, like, many of these folks are Christians making theological arguments, But there's also folks that are acting as Christians in that they are, as Dylan said, the body of Christ in the church, in advocating for the church's rights, in advocating for the self-governance of various religious orders, of all of this. And there is a narrative about liberalism that it's this hollowed out atomistic individualism. And what you're seeing when you go and you trace the roots of these concepts of natural rights, rule of law, religious liberty, these aren't grounded in abstract philosophical claims for some individual to claim something from society. But these are the results of society, of organic groups in society themselves negotiating with each other space for ultimately freedom of conscience. But this gives you that the rights of the church are not separate from the rights of individuals, is that these are distinct, but they're not separate. And the struggle for the rights of the church in the ancient world, and then again in the early modern world when all sorts of religious upset in the West happens and these need to be negotiated anew, are not fundamentally separate from the struggle for individual rights and this sort of thing. And that was one of the things I was taken with when looking, and even the colonial governments and different relationships and organization between different civil powers. John Locke, famously talks about how the state of nature exists between nations.
Yeah.
This is
Right.
like where it exists, and we're seeing that in the world today. I mean, we see that in the news every day. Is that these things exist, and in fact, sometimes the examples par excellence are not of individuals, but of nations, of churches, of communities, of all of these organs of civil society that sometimes run into friction with each other. John.
Well, Dylan mentioned James Madison earlier, but I was thinking of number 10 with faction will balance faction. If you're at a good school, you'll have read that by the time you graduate, Federalist number 10. And we often read that. We don't think it doesn't say individual will balance individual. There's just kind of assumption that the factions are normal because we all have our interests, and these factions could be religious groups, they could be very local groups, they could be agriculture versus commercial. They could be different types of agriculture. I mean, it really depends on the part of the country. So you get that sense, I think, among the sources as well. I think it's good that you latch onto that. That's not something we talk about explicitly as a theme, but certainly when we're talking about consent and representation and limited government, we have to ask, well, what exactly is limiting the government? There's a tendency of government to grow and become coercive, and several of the sources warn about that that we cite in the book. So how do you limit government? Now, the church tried to limit the king in Magna Carta, right? And because the king was trying to limit the church. The interesting thing to me about Western civilization, as a specialist in American history, I should say, is there's no chicken and egg quandary with most of these kings. Like the church is there first. But if you read this, if you look at the story of Becket, and I just finished the movie, so forgive me, I don't think we have any sources of it. But if you look at the quandary between Henry II and Thomas Becket, say, or any of these legal fights between church law and the law of the realm, it seems natural from the modern perspective to say, well, of course you should just have one law in your realm. Why would you have more? Well, because this law was there first, and now you're trying to encroach on it. And so the English political and legal tradition is especially, of course, apropos to American history, with the law that's common to all, and clerical laws, ecclesiastical laws, the law of the realm. It's this complex soup. And when we have Thomas Jefferson's preamble to the Declaration of Independence in here, but we have the full summary of the rights of British America in here as well, which was written 2 years before the Declaration. And you get a great sense of Jefferson talking about God and natural rights, and free trade is a natural right, and here's why. But you get, at the same time, you see that these are also held to be very distinctively English rights. But it doesn't make them any less the rights of everybody. These are just rights that the English settlers have already had, and they want to hang on to them. They think they're as much a part of the British Empire as those living back in Great Britain. And in fact, they have colonial documents from the 1650s to prove it, This is the long tradition. He quotes those in that. So I think every American, when they're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, needs also to read the summary view, which is in here.
Yeah.
The historian Ada Palmer at the University of Chicago, she's a historian of the Renaissance, which is also sort of, a famous, maybe the most famous retrieval movement in at least Western human history. She talks about how early figures like Petrarch looked back on the ancients and thought, if we just read what the ancients read, maybe we can have the sort of character that the ancients had, and maybe we could be great like the ancients if we did like the ancients. And sort of the lesson of the Renaissance after a while was, you know what? If you read the ancients, it sometimes it doesn't make you noble like the ancients. And then
how noble were the ancients?
Sometimes
and this is the other question.
I'm sorry.
No, this is the other question. And as more of the ancients get translated, all of a sudden you start to get a much fuller account of what the life of the ancients was like. But then you also have this turn where folks, this is the beginning of, she talks about, the beginnings of political science in this period, where people start to look, maybe we just have to look and see common threads in history, and we try to figure out sort of the science of how people relate to each other, how warfare is conducted, et cetera, that it's not enough to just read the ancients. You have to draw some sort of lessons, that this doesn't come from you by osmosis. You have some discussion questions in this book that have been alluded to. And I like discussion questions because, let me start with, I don't like discussion questions because you should always be asking yourself discussion questions as you read. You shouldn't need discussion questions if you're reading actively. That being said, this is designed in many ways for classroom use. And one of the things you're teaching is to ask questions as you're reading. And sometimes questions can be helpful. When you were putting together these questions, you're doing that sort of second order thing. They're reading, they're meditating, they're taking in on the readings, they're getting whatever they can get by osmosis. But then you take it to this other level. How do you think about those discussion questions and how that they should frame sort of the reception of this tradition with readers of this?
So we really wanted that as kind of a capstone for each of the parts of the book, just to hopefully ask people to kind of take a minute, pause before you keep reading, before you keep going, and really think through, not just, okay, you've read our introduction, our argument, you've read the sources, but what connections do you see, right? And these sources, as John has mentioned, it's not like they're all saying exactly the same thing. They come at these issues from different perspectives. Sometimes they are important steps along the way, and they don't represent the fullness of everything we might want in some of these principles, or the fullness of even what was there at the American founding in the Constitution or Bill of Rights. But they're important along the way, and I think taking that moment to ask, okay, well, how does Tertullian relate to Thomas Jefferson? Or, how does St. John Chrysostom relate to Thomas Aquinas and relate to the Declaration of Independence? It can hopefully actually generate discussion. Hopefully if it is being read, whether in a classroom or a book club or something like that, it's something that you can use to get the conversation going, But also even if you're just reading on your own, to take that time to look back and be like, okay, I've just read through this, and you know what, there is a connection there, and I don't know if this one really fits. That's fine. What we want is people to actually be interacting with the real sources. It's a reader, and as you mentioned, and a lot of people today just aren't doing that. And it's not even just that, I'm not upset at the average American for not doing it. I'm upset at the people who are masquerading as historians. Frankly, some of the people I've mentioned, like Deneen and Vermeule and Hazoni, who have not done their homework. I mean, they just haven't. If you've read those sources, you know that they're getting them wrong, to the extent that they reference them, at all. And what we want is just for people to be exposed to them and to think them through and to wrestle with those ideas. So, not like a learn by osmosis sort of thing. We don't think that if you're going to read these sources, suddenly you're going to end up with one particular opinion. At the American founding, there was not one particular opinion. One of the inclusions that I like a lot is it Brutus number 10, I believe? Number 2, sorry, Brutus number 2, by Robert Yates. He was an anti-federalist. So he thought the Constitution was like a bad idea. But in Brutus number 2, he's arguing for why the Constitution needs a Bill of Rights, which of course it got one, right? Right. So he's a really important voice. He might not be one of the drafters of the Constitution, but maybe we wouldn't have a Bill of Rights or the Bill of Rights in the form that we have it without him. And seeing, as Madison said, how faction plays against faction, when you have these conditions of freedom and tolerance where you can do that without picking up guns and swords against each other, that's a really special thing. And so I don't think readers of this are gonna, get to the end and say, okay, now I know who to vote for. Like that's not the goal of the volume at all. The goal of the volume is to feel like, well, now I know a little bit better about what our American system's all about, what my Christian heritage has to do with that. And inevitably they're gonna find where that fits into their own perspective.
Yeah. So there's a very provocative question that this book begins with, and I want to turn it over to both of you. And the question is it starts with, it would seem liberalism is bad.
Yeah.
Is liberalism bad? Because so much of the controversy revolves around this question. Controversy with Christian nationalists, controversy with integralists, controversy with national conservatives, these folks. It revolves around this question. And I think this book answers that, but it doesn't answer that in a simple way. It answers that by complicating it, which I really, really appreciate. And how does as you were each putting together the book, how do you think it answers that question?
Well, Dylan, you largely worked on the introduction.
So that phrasing is very purposefully scholastic. If you read someone like Thomas Aquinas, or really almost anybody from the Middle Ages, East and West, in fact, they'll use this typical scholastic method. And they start with what they're trying to talk about, what the argument they're going to make. They want to start with the objections. Just like modern scholars today, good scholars anyway, will survey the state of scholarship. They'll say, here's what people have been saying. Here's what I'm going to argue. Here's what I'm going to add to that. So they do the same thing, and they usually begin by saying, well, it would seem that, and you can see this in the readings from Thomas Aquinas, it would seem like natural law can be changed, right? And then he'll go into, the best 4 or 5, objections in favor of that point that he can think of, citing sources. But then he'll get to a point where he'll say, but on the contrary, and then he'll cite a good authority, and then he'll make his argument, right? And so I use that structure in part to, try to allude to there's this broader scholastic Christian background to all of this. But also, this is kind of the case today, that you have a lot of people, this is kind of the common ground that a lot of these critics have. They all think liberalism is bad. And they all tend to have a very narrow understanding of what liberalism is. Someone like Deneen, I will say, does at least distinguish between classical liberalism and a more progressive liberalism. But ultimately, he thinks that they're two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. They're kind of it's like this self-contradictory, almost like a Marxist sort of, this system is going to come apart because it's inherently self-contradictory. That's kind of his perspective on liberalism and on American liberalism in particular. But what we point out is that there are just lots of different kinds of liberalism. So there's a general liberalism that I think basically any philosophy or political philosophy needs to be called liberal. And that's basically what Robert Filmer was complaining about, that all people by nature are free and equal, and that the only just laws are those that they consent to, right? But beyond that, there's actually a lot of variety. So there's French liberalism, which said, in order to establish that, we're going to chop off as many heads as we need to. That's a very bad kind of liberalism. I'm not in favor of that liberalism. I think the French Revolution was a very bad thing. On the other hand, the English common law tradition, and then particularly the American instantiation of that, has further kind of theological basis to it. Again and again, even again, people like Thomas Jefferson, who's a deist, but he does believe in God. He's talking about providence. He's talking about natural law. He's talking about human beings, you get this, like, I think Wilson, we have him in there, James Wilson, talking about God creating human beings in a particular way, right? We're creating God's image, and that means something, not just for me as an individual. Again, they're not really individualists in the way that people talk about that term today, but for human society, for any kind of just society, it's going to treat everyone properly. And so that's the idea, is like, things have changed. I would say 10 years ago, people were complaining about neoliberalism. They would always qualify it. And those more left-wing sort of critics. A lot of times they meant something similar, although they were aimed more at kind of the Washington consensus, foreign policy, economic order kind of stuff. These conservative critics probably also don't like neoliberalism, but they're like, seeing rays, right? Like they're checking rays, right? Like they're like, we're gonna go back even farther. We're gonna just indict all liberalism. We're not gonna qualify it at all. And so it's actually, I think, less precise. And I think a lot of those, 10 years ago polemics against neoliberalism are pretty muddied. It's this big black box. This is worse. This is less precise than even that. So again, we just wanted to complicate things, as you said, and add some nuance. I mean, that's what, the kind of the positive way of saying complicating. Complicating sounds like, oh no, now what do I do? This is complicated, which is true. But also it is nuanced. So you can see, oh, okay, yeah, in some cases, there are bad expressions of this, right? In other cases, there are better expressions of this. And of course, from a Christian point of view, there is no ideal society, but there are better and worse ones. And that's what we're trying to argue, is that these principles, at least, are some of the best of Christian history that came together in a very unique way. And that American liberalism, at least, is perhaps not bad.
So if the thing not to do is to think of liberalism as this precisely defined thing that these men invented in the early 18th century, in the late 18th century, but that seems to be the approach of liberalism's critics, who, by the way, I should add, spend too much time talking about Thomas Hobbes, who was not a liberal,
right?
But if we look at the things that are part of liberalism, these attributes of liberalism, well, we might say, so what is liberalism? Does that involve representation and consent? Because here's examples of that from throughout Christian history. And we could go elsewhere for that too. Limited government. Here's efforts to limit government for years and years, going back to the statement by Jesus that Lord Acton was fond of quoting as the beginning of liberty, right? Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Private property, even religious liberty, as I called it, a work in progress, but even religious liberty, natural rights, rule of law, these things aren't specifically liberal. To the degree that which they're so obviously connected to natural law and natural rights, they're not even specifically Christian. I mean, that is, you could discern your way to these through reason. And so when nuance can sometimes be me wanting to deconstruct what you believe to the point where now you don't know what to believe. That's not what Dylan and I mean by nuance, and we certainly don't, not that by complexity. It's just that the truth of the matter is more complicated than conspiracy theories and arguments against a straw man liberalism would have you think. And when you finish this book, you say, oh, so now it's more complicated, but that's actually a good thing. There is a definite Christian history here. And it's not the one that says only this church should be legal and all these others should be illegal. It's not like the neo-integralist one, which would, in the end, force Jews into second-class status. It's not those kinds at all. This is something different. Now, there's an old way of looking at liberalism by historians where you would say, well, with the breakdown of Christian unity, there's a sort of a double response. There's the age-old nationalistic response where you raise your particular place up, and then there's liberalism where you try to retain enough of the universalism of the Christian faith. and these are the two responses, but you've kind of broken Christianity in half or something. I don't think that tells the complete story either. So the sources are important, but I think Dylan's point from earlier is really key here, that many people have tried to go back to the early years of the church, let's say. Protestant reformers did this. Catholics did this after Vatican II and the whole movement to kind of revive the early Christian fathers and desert fathers. The Renaissance people, all these folks just washed over the Middle Ages like there was 1,000 years of history that didn't matter and there was no development. The Americans, it's important to say that people like Hamilton did think he was creating something new. But he was in his 20s and he didn't know better. Okay, so even those who think they're creating something new under the sun, we as historians can trace it back further. So again, I guess I'm speaking to the value of the reader at this point.
Well, and even for that, I'll just add, making something new to Hamilton still meant like reading Magna Carta and trying to be faithful to that, right? I mean, like a document from the Middle Ages, all of them are very familiar with it. And, to the point where today, I think Americans have more reverence for Magna Carta than the British sometimes, right?
I mean, if creating something new requires you to quote the Bible 70% of the time as, the most quoted source at the Constitutional Convention, or on up through the 1850s making references to Roman Republican politics and Cato, et cetera, then that's really not that new, is it?
Right.
Everything comes from somewhere.
Yeah.
And the very best of liberalism comes out of this Christian heritage. and you both have done an amazing job in putting together some sources to introduce people to that who might not be familiar, who might not know where these things come from. And who might think, wrongly that some of these things aren't consonant with the Christian tradition. There's a lot of folks today making a lot of noise claiming that they're not, and you have both done an excellent job in responding to, or not even responding to that, in letting the sources speak for themselves in responding to that. John, Dylan, thank you so much for your book, and thank you for being on Acton Line.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.